The audiophile hobby is a racket. You're constantly bombarded with promises of supreme sound quality, but only if you spend serious money. We know this is not true, and companies like Schiit, Scanline, audeze, and Eco have proven time and again that you can get great results with little investment. Fosi Audio is yet another Chinese brand that's been kicking around for years. They don't seem to compete directly with the big boys, but with their most recent release, maybe that's about to change. This is the Fosi Audio K5 Pro. It costs $80, but on Amazon you can currently find it on sale for $60. The K5 Pro aims to be your small desktop and gaming companion. Fosi Audio sent me the K5 Pro to review. Let's see what it can really do. Fosi says that the K5 Pro was built for gaming. It is compatible with PS4, PS5, Xbox, PC, and Mac, and of course, the Nintendo Switch. Fosi says that they use a quote, premium 24-bit DAC, and on their website actually provide a breakdown of the components. The DAC is now the quite old PCM 5100. Texas Instruments says on their website that this DAC should not be used for new designs, but it is still in production. The K5 Pro is able to support all forms of high-resolution PCM, but this device will not decode DSD or MQA. Check your audio collection and see how many are even 24-bit PCM, let alone DSD. I will point out that the USB interface on this device limits you to 96 kHz sampling, while the coaxial and optical will give you the full 192 kHz. Again, check your audio and see if there's anything that is sampled to more than 48 kHz. Fosi claims that we'll get 1 watt at 16 ohms and a maximum of 80 milliwatts at 300 ohms. They also provide power output estimates of 32, 64, and 128 ohms, which is nice to see. The K5 has a couple of notable features. First, the product has a headphone and microphone output. The packaging comes with a combo cable in case you need it. Second, the K5 has bass and treble adjustment knobs. Fosi doesn't say how many decibels we can play with here. Let's quickly discuss build. The K5 Pro is built of aluminum and sits sturdy on the desk. Even the knobs are metal and turn smoothly. The front panel contains the headphone and mic outputs, 3 LEDs to indicate input mode, and of course the 3 knobs. Along with bass and treble, we also have a volume knob that doubles as a power switch and input selector. Long pressing this knob will turn the device on and off. Short pressing will switch inputs. The back panel houses the USB-C, optical, and coaxial inputs. We also get RCA out for line out to powered speakers or other amplifiers. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but I have seen uglier devices. And say what you will about the brand, the K5 Pro's external build is quite good. To test this amp DAC, I use the same type of method I employ in all of my amp and DAC reviews. Comparisons using passive AB switches and listening for audible differences is the key. I conducted these tests in multiple phases, all of which you can replicate yourself at home with off-the-shelf parts and freeware. In Phase 1, I simply used the K5 for several weeks as my go-to desktop amp DAC. I plugged it into my Windows PC and my Mac. I used various headphones and IEMs and listened to high-res audio and streamed low-resolution audio. In Phase 2, I plugged the K5's line out to the Schiit Magni Heresy. In this test, I wanted to figure out if there was any audible distortion, hiss, or any other oddities in the signal. In Phase 3, I compared the K5 head-to-head against a couple of alternatives. This included the Sound Blaster G6, Topping EX5, and the RME ADI2 DAC. The goal here was to figure out if there are any audible differences between the K5 and these competitors. I have already discussed the EX5, G6, and ADI2 in many previous reviews. These are neutral, transparent amp DACs. While doing the head-to-head comparisons, I used a passive AB switch plugged into each of these amp DACs. I used Voice Meter Banana for Windows to send signal to 2 DACs at once. On Mac, I created a multi-output device for the same result. Of course, I tried to volume match. I started with the EQ levels at their stock middle setting on the K5 and did not use any filters or EQ on the comparative DACs. Finally, in Phase 4, I listened to numerous headphones of various impedances to determine if the K5 seemed to provide sufficient power for perceived loudness. As always, within this phase, I used high-impedance headphones like the Beyerdynamic T1 2nd Gen and hard-to-drive headphones like the Mouthouse Argon. For these tests, I used many headphones and IEMs. Within that list were the Avantone Planar, HD6XX, Rode NTH100, Campfire Audio Andromeda, hifi T2, and the ZMF Icon. I listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD as my primary source. I want to emphasize that there is nothing particularly difficult about doing these types of comparisons at home yourself. You should, and I encourage people to constantly test new gear. In fact, for the minimal startup cost of around $25, you can have a reliable A/B test setup. This is really the only way to distance yourself from the typical reviewer hype and the constant bickering among audiophiles. Now that we've talked about the testing methods, let's get right to the results. In Phase 1, I listened to the K5 by itself. I never noticed any issues with connection to my various devices. My PC and Mac immediately recognized this device. Throughout my time with it, my computers did not lose connection and I never experienced any audible jitter or distortion through any of the USB connections. The K5 cannot connect to Android or iOS, at least not for me. Using the appropriate cables, it never turned on with my LG V30 or iPhone 14 Max. Someone posted a review on Amazon with a similar problem, but said eventually they found a solution to connect to their Android device. The bass and treble adjustment worked flawlessly. These knobs turn smoothly, firmly, and without fault. There is an audible change when adjusting these levels. Unfortunately, Fosi does not say how much swing the K5 provides. If I were to guess, I would say that there is no more than 10 decibel swing from one end to the other, so 5 decibel boost and a 5 decibel decrease. This, as I said, is only a guess. The bass adjustment seems to affect both sub-bass and mid-bass. Even when full bass was applied on the K5, I never heard any bass distortion. The treble adjustment seems to mostly affect low to maybe mid-treble, between 2 kHz and 5 kHz. I confirmed this when I listened to tracks that have vocal sibilance. Altering the treble materially changed the impression of sibilance, but horns and brass instruments tended to not be affected nearly as much. Ultimately, the K5 exhibited no connection issues and no particular problems in all the time I used it exclusively. One thing to note is that super-sensitive IEMs, such as the Andromedas, will pick up hiss. If you plan to use very low impedance headphones or IEMs, then the K5 might not be the best choice. Of course, while playing music, the hiss is unlikely to be audible. Let's move on to Phase 2. This is where I plug the Heresy into the K5. The K5 sends signal out while still connected to headphones, so you can listen to headphones and your powered speakers if you want. Or if you feel adventurous, you can plug headphones into the K5 and have another pair plugged into an external amp that's connected to the K5. The K5's line out is variable. This means that the volume knob will also affect the RCA output, and concurrently, also the headphone output on the K5. And yes, the K5's EQ will also affect the RCA line out. Because the K5 allows dual output at once, I decided to use my A/B switch on the Heresy and K5 at the same time. The results I got were interesting. But before we get to those findings, we might as well talk about the head-to-head comparisons. This brings us to Phase 3 of the testing. This is when I did A/B test against the G6, ADI2, and EX5. After repeated attempts using various headphones and IEMs, playing a litany of audio, and a few things became patently obvious. First, the K5 has a noticeably different sound. This difference is entirely in bass. Treble sounds practically identical when compared to the other amp DACs. The K5's bass is actually a bit reduced, and I'd probably call it rolled off if I were talking about a headphone. Sub-bass and mid-bass are affected in this manner. Going back and forth, that difference was always present as long as the track utilized those particular frequencies. The second observation is that I could reasonably match the K5's bass to the comparative DAC amps using the K5's bass knob. This adjustment is not exact, but generally around the 2 or 3 o'clock mark, I was close enough that it became very difficult to tell the bass presentation apart. This brings me to the third observation, which has to do with my previously mentioned A/B test involving the Heresy. The output on the Heresy sounded identical to the headphone output on the K5. When I compared the K5 and Heresy combo against the G6, EX5, and ADI2, that difference was again present. The G6, EX5, and ADI2 all had more bass emphasis, which I could match on the K5 with the adjustment knob. What I can conclude from Phase 3 is that the K5 does indeed have a noticeably different sound, which is seemingly entirely in bass. But with a bit of adjustment, you can't get that bass matched to transparent DAC amps. Lastly, we should briefly talk about Phase 4. This is where I used various headphones to determine if the K5 struggled to drive them. The short answer is basically no. For the vast majority of headphones, the K5 is plenty powerful. I did have a little bit of difficulty powering my T1 to peak performance. My Avantone Planar, Audeze LCD2, and Monolith M1570, on the other hand, all worked perfectly well. I think that the Argons were, frankly, underpowered, sounded muddy, and unclear. I would not recommend the K5 for anything like the Argon. Ultimately, I think the K5 performed really well. I never had issues with connection. This device does have an audible difference in bass compared to transparent DAC amps, but that difference can be compensated for. And the K5 is able to drive the vast majority of headphones, to say nothing about how easy it will be to drive IEMs. Every time a new DAC or amp gets released, the audiophile hype begins anew. No matter what new shiny product is in the market this month, when next month's version comes out, the process will start again. I appreciate products that are reasonably priced and do something unique. If you want cheap power, then shit's your company. If you want cheap tubes, then go to Dark Voice. If you want handmade luxury, you've got Woo Audio. If you want to drool over measurements, then buy any of the DACs and amps that Topping and SMSL release every other month. But among all this noise of constant hype, we do have some standout products. The Sandblaster G6, for example, is a great option, especially for PC users. Its integrated software is superb. If you want the full panoply of features for a reasonable price, then take a look at the Topping EX5. But what about the very budget-restricted audiophiles or gamers? Well, that category usually has to settle for mediocrity at best. I think Fosi has changed that perspective. For less than $100 and currently on sale for $60, you get a whole lot from the K5 Pro. USB-C connectivity without reliance on an external power supply, the ability to connect gaming consoles, solid build quality, rudimentary but usable EQ, powerful headphone output, and RCA output to speakers or other amps. That's a great set of features for very little money. The K5 Pro isn't exactly transparent or neutral. There's a noticeable difference in bass response compared to actual transparent amp DACs, but you can adjust on the K5 to get the response in the transparent ballpark. Overall, I think the K5 Pro is a very good product. Sure, it could have some improvements. For example, Bluetooth connectivity would be a plus. A separate power input USB would be nice in the event people want to connect to mobile devices without having to worry about which is compatible. But this might be nitpicking, considering the price and what we actually do get included. So, yes, I think the K5 Pro is value. If you can find it for the sale price, it is a bargain. Even at its full MSRP, the K5 Pro offers more at less cost than rivals that have similar features. If you're looking for an affordable, portable amp DAC that will connect to most devices, the K5 Pro is an excellent option.